I came home expecting a family dinner. Instead, I found a sold sign in front of the house I grew up in. I actually laughed when I first saw it. Not because it was funny. Because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. I was sitting in my car at the curb, staring through the windshield at the same white two-story house I'd spent 27 years calling home. Same crooked maple tree in the front yard. Same cracked section of sidewalk where my brother Tyler had wiped out on his bike when he was 9. Same little blue shutters my dad had painted 3 different times because Mom refused to replace them. And now, planted right in the middle of the front lawn, was a professional real estate sign. Sold. There was a red strip across the bottom. I checked the address. Then I checked my phone. Then the address again. It was my house. Or at least, I thought it was. My parents had texted me that afternoon asking if I could come over for dinner. Nothing unusual. Mom had written, "Come around 6. Dad's grilling. We haven't seen you in a while." I had almost canceled. I'd been working late, and the 45-minute drive across town wasn't exactly convenient. But my mom had been complaining for weeks that I never came by anymore, so I figured I'd make the effort. I even stopped at a bakery and bought the lemon pie she liked. I had it sitting on the passenger seat. That detail still bothers me. I was carrying a pie into a house that, apparently, wasn't theirs anymore. I got out of the car. The sold sign moved slightly in the evening wind. I walked up the driveway, expecting someone to jump out and tell me it was a prank. Nobody did. The front door opened before I reached it. My younger brother, Tyler, stood there. He looked at me. Then he looked past me at the sign, and his face went completely blank. "Why are you here?" I stared at him. "Mom invited me to dinner." He didn't answer. "Tyler?" He stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind him. That was when I knew something was very wrong. "What happened?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know how to tell you this." My stomach dropped. "You're scaring me." He looked toward the street. "Dad sold the house." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. "Sold it to who?" "I don't know." "Where are Mom and Dad?" "They're inside." I looked at the house. "Then why are you standing out here?" Tyler didn't answer. I held up the pie. "I came for dinner." He looked at it, then at me, and quietly said, "You probably shouldn't go inside yet." That sentence did something to me. It turned the whole situation from confusing into terrifying. What does that mean? Before he could answer, the front door opened again. My father stood there. He was wearing the same old work shirt he'd worn for years, but something about him looked different. Smaller, somehow. My mother stood behind him. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. Dad's eyes went straight to the pie in my hand. "You came." I stared at him. Apparently, I came to the wrong house. Mom flinched. Dad sighed. "Come inside." I didn't move. "Is the house sold?" He looked at Mom, then back at me. "Yes." I felt my throat tighten. "When?" "A few weeks ago." "A few weeks?" "Yes." "And you didn't tell me?" Mom stepped forward. "We were going to." "When?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I looked at Dad. Why is there a sold sign outside my childhood home, and I'm finding out from the lawn? Dad's jaw tightened. "It's complicated." "Then explain it." He looked toward the kitchen. "Come inside first." I walked through the front door. And that was somehow worse than seeing the sign. Everything was still there. The old brass umbrella stand, Mom's framed family photos, the hallway runner she'd bought at a craft fair when I was 12, the dent in the wall where Tyler had thrown a baseball through the hallway window and somehow blamed the dog. But the house felt wrong. Bare. There were empty patches on the walls. Boxes stacked near the stairs. The dining room table was covered with paperwork. It looked like someone had started taking the house apart piece by piece. I put the pie down. "What's going on?" Dad sat at the kitchen table. Mom sat beside him. Tyler stayed standing. I pulled out a chair. Dad folded his hands. "We've been thinking about selling for a long time." "No, you haven't." He looked surprised. "Yes, we have." "Dad, you spent $10,000 replacing the roof 2 years ago. That was necessary. You planted a tree in the backyard last spring. That doesn't mean anything. Mom just redid the kitchen. Mom looked down. I stared at both of them. You weren't planning to sell. Dad sighed. We weren't. That was the first honest answer I'd gotten. Then, what changed? Nobody spoke. Tyler finally pulled out a chair. I think she deserves to know. Dad shot him a look. Tyler, no. My brother looked at me. She deserves to know. I felt a strange pressure building behind my ribs. Know what? Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad looked exhausted. We needed the money. I blinked. How much? He hesitated. Enough. That isn't an answer. Dad leaned back. The house sold for $640,000. I stared at him. 640? He nodded. That still doesn't explain anything. Mom finally spoke. Your father had some debts. What kind of debts? Business debts. I looked at Dad. What business? He didn't answer. And that's when I remembered something. My father had owned a small commercial landscaping company for years. It had never been huge. A few trucks. A handful of employees. Some municipal contracts. He'd always told us it was doing fine. Maybe not amazing, but fine. Did the business fail? Dad's silence answered for him. I felt a chill move through me. How bad? He rubbed his forehead. Bad enough. I looked at Mom. How much debt? She started crying. Dad answered. About $300,000. I stared at him. You sold our house to cover the business? It wasn't just the house. What does that mean? Dad looked at me. We had other assets. What other assets? He didn't answer. I stood. I'm not understanding why everyone is acting like this is normal. Dad's voice became firmer. Because it's our house. No. I pointed toward the living room. It's the house I grew up in. You don't get to sell it and then act like I'm being unreasonable for asking questions. Mom whispered, We knew you'd react like this. I looked at her. Because you knew I'd be upset? Because you always get emotional about this house. That hurt more than I expected. I'm emotional because you sold the only home I've ever known, without telling me. Dad shook his head. You're making this about memories. Because memories are what houses are made of. No, he said. They're made of money. The kitchen went silent. I looked at him. He seemed to realize what he'd said, but he didn't take it back. Tyler looked uncomfortable. Dad? What? Dad snapped. You don't have to talk to her like that. Dad stood. This isn't your business. Tyler stared at him. It became my business when you asked me to help move everything. I looked between them. Why did you ask Tyler? Dad didn't answer. That question seemed to change the room. I turned toward my brother. What have you been helping with? Tyler looked at Dad. Dad said nothing. Finally, Tyler sighed. There's a storage unit. What storage unit? The one Dad rented 3 months ago. For what? Documents. Furniture. Some of Mom's stuff. I frowned. Why? Tyler looked at me. I don't know. I knew he was lying. Not well. But enough. I walked over to the dining room table. There were folders everywhere. I started looking through them. Mom stood. Don't. I stopped. Why? Because those are private. So is selling my childhood home behind my back. They're Dad's business documents. Then why are they on the dining room table? Dad stepped between me and the papers. Because we're dealing with the sale. I looked at him. Who bought the house? He hesitated. A company. What company? Ridgeway Properties. I pulled out my phone. What's the buyer's address? Dad's expression changed. Why? Because I want to know who bought my house. He didn't answer. That was strange. Too strange. I sat back down. Dad, what aren't you telling me? He looked at Mom. Mom looked at the floor. Tyler finally said, You should tell her. Dad turned toward him. Stay out of it. You told me this would be easier. My heart started pounding. Easier for who? Nobody answered. I looked at Tyler. What did Dad tell you? Tyler looked miserable. He said you'd understand once everything was done. Once what was done? He closed his eyes. I shouldn't have said anything. I stood. Tyler, he looked at me. Dad didn't just sell the house. Dad's face went pale. Stop. Tyler swallowed. He transferred something else too. I looked at Dad. What? Dad didn't speak. Mom whispered. Please. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something. Transferred what? Tyler looked at me. Your grandfather's property. My breath caught. My grandfather had died when I was 17. He owned a small piece of land outside town. Nothing spectacular, about 12 acres. He had always called it the farm, even though it hadn't been a working farm in decades. When he died, Dad told us the property had gone to him. I never questioned it. Apparently, I should have. What about Grandpa's land? Dad finally spoke. It was part of the deal. I stared at him. You sold it too? Yes. Why? To get enough money to settle everything. How much did you get? Dad didn't answer. I walked to the table. There was an envelope sitting underneath a stack of invoices. I picked it up. My father's name was on the front. So was the name of a law firm I recognized. I looked at him. Why is an attorney involved? Because real estate transactions require attorneys. Not always. Dad's expression hardened. Put it down. I didn't. I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of a document. At first, it looked like a normal closing statement. Then I saw the property description. The house, the land, and another parcel. My grandfather's property. But something caught my attention. A second name appeared beneath my father's. My name. I read it again. Then again. Why is my name here? Dad went completely still. Mom covered her mouth. Tyler stared at the document. What? I turned the paper around. My name is on this. Dad reached for it. I pulled it back. No. Nobody said you had anything to do with this. Then why am I listed? Dad looked trapped. I don't know. You don't know? I'd have to ask the attorney. Then call him. It's late. Call him. Dad didn't move. I felt my hands beginning to shake. Dad, did you sell something that belonged to me? His silence was enough. I sat down. For years, I'd assumed my parents' decisions were theirs. Their house, their money, their business, their property. But now my name was sitting on a document connected to the sale, and nobody had told me. I looked at Mom. Did you sign something for me? No. Did Dad? She looked at him. I don't know. That answer scared me more than anything else. I spent the next hour going through everything I could find, not because I wanted to invade their privacy, because I needed to understand what had happened. I found old tax records, insurance paperwork, a copy of Grandpa's original will, and then I found something that made my stomach drop, a handwritten note. It was tucked inside an old folder marked Estate, 2009. I recognized Grandpa's handwriting immediately. The note was only a few lines long. I read it twice. Then I looked at Dad. Why does this say my name? Dad didn't answer. The note mentioned the 12-acre property. It mentioned my grandfather's wishes. And it mentioned something I'd never heard before. A trust. I had no idea what that meant. I looked at the date. The trust had been created shortly before Grandpa died. My name was listed as the beneficiary. I looked at Dad. You told me Grandpa left everything to you. I said I inherited the property. You did. I did. You never told me about this. Dad sat down. His face looked older than it had an hour earlier. I thought the trust was terminated. What does that mean? It means there was a condition. What condition? He stared at the floor. You couldn't receive the property until you turned 30. I looked at the date. I was 29. My birthday was 6 weeks away. Suddenly, the entire room seemed to tilt. The house had been sold. The property had been transferred. And I was 6 weeks away from turning 30. I looked at Dad. You knew. He didn't deny it. You knew I was about to become the legal beneficiary. Mom started crying. Dad finally whispered, "Yes." I couldn't speak. "Then why sell it now?" He looked at me, and his answer made my blood run cold. "Because if we waited 6 more weeks, we couldn't." I stared at him. "What do you mean, we couldn't?" He looked away. And that's when I realized the house hadn't been sold because my parents simply needed money. They had sold it because they were running out of time. I looked back down at the paperwork. The closing date was 6 days earlier. 6 weeks before my birthday. 6 weeks before the trust was supposed to transfer. But there was something else. A signature. I recognized it immediately. It was mine. I had never signed that document. My hands went numb. "Dad?" He looked at me. "Whose signature is this?" He didn't answer. I pushed the paper toward him. "Because that is not my signature." Nobody spoke. Then Tyler whispered, "Dad?" My father looked at the document. His face changed. And for the first time that night, I understood that he wasn't afraid I'd find out the house had been sold. He was afraid I'd find out who had signed my name to sell it. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The dining room suddenly felt much smaller than it had 5 minutes earlier. The same room where my mother used to set the table for Thanksgiving. The same room where my grandfather had once sat at the head of the table and told me that a house was never just wood and drywall if you had enough memories inside it. My father looked at me. Tyler looked at my father. And I realized something that made my stomach drop. They weren't surprised that I had found the signature. They were surprised that I had found out about it this soon. "Who signed it?" I asked. My father rubbed both hands over his face. "Please," he said quietly. "Just sit down. I've been sitting down my whole life while everyone else makes decisions for me." My voice wasn't loud. That seemed to bother him more than if I had screamed. Tyler finally spoke. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I turned toward him. "What wasn't?" He swallowed. "The sale." My father shot him a look. "Tyler." "No, Dad." Tyler looked at me. "She deserves to know." That was the first moment I realized Tyler wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of what would happen when I knew the truth. I pushed the folder toward my father. "You said the house was sold because you couldn't afford the taxes anymore." He nodded slowly. "You said there was an offer from a buyer who wanted to renovate it." Another nod. "And you told me I wasn't involved because Grandpa left everything to you." My father looked down. "I said those things because I thought I was protecting you." I almost laughed. "From what?" He didn't answer, so I asked the question I'd been avoiding since I saw the sold sign. "Who actually owns my childhood home?" My father finally looked up, and the expression on his face told me I was about to hear something my family had been hiding for years. "Your grandfather never left that house to me." I stared at him. "What?" "He left it to you." The room went silent. I thought I had misunderstood him. "Me?" "Yes." "That's impossible." "It isn't." My father opened the folder again. His hands were shaking now. Inside was a photocopy of an old legal document. The paper was yellowed around the edges, and at the bottom was my grandfather's signature. I recognized it immediately. My grandfather had signed birthday cards the same way. Big, careful letters. I leaned closer. The document was a trust agreement dated 18 years earlier. My name was there. Not my father's. Mine. I looked at my father. "Why didn't I know about this?" He closed his eyes. "Because your grandfather made me promise." "Promise what?" "That I would manage the property until you were old enough to make your own decisions." I felt cold despite the warmth in the room. "How old?" 18. I looked toward the window. The house outside was dark, except for the porch light. My entire childhood had happened in that house. My first day of kindergarten. My mother's birthday parties. The height marks my grandfather had drawn on the pantry door. The summer I learned to ride a bike. The Christmas when the power went out, and Grandpa lit candles throughout the living room, and told us it was better that way because the house looked like it belonged in another century. And all these years, I had believed my father owned it. Apparently, he had only been holding it for me. Then how did you sell it?" My father didn't answer. Tyler did. Because the sale wasn't actually final. I turned to him. What? Tyler pulled out his phone. The buyer's attorney found a problem during title review. He showed me an email. I read it twice. The proposed sale had been placed on hold because the title company could not verify the seller's authority to transfer the property. My father's name was on the original deed. But attached to the deed was the trust agreement. The title company had discovered that the house was held for my benefit. The sale couldn't close without my signature. My signature. The one someone had forged. I looked at Tyler. That's why you were nervous. He nodded. I found out 3 days ago. Why didn't you tell me? He looked ashamed. Because your dad asked me not to. I turned toward my father. Of course he did. He flinched. It wasn't supposed to become this. Then what was it supposed to become? My father sat down. For the first time in my life, he looked old. Not like my dad. Just like a tired man who had made too many decisions and had run out of places to hide them. Your grandfather was sick, he said. He knew he didn't have much time. He was worried about what would happen to the house after he was gone. So he put it in my name. Technically, in a trust for you. Why? Because he knew me. That answer hurt more than anything else. My father stared at the table. He knew I loved the house, but he also knew I was terrible with money. He knew the business had debts. He knew I was always borrowing against something to keep things running. I remembered my grandfather's last Christmas. He had called me into the kitchen while everyone else was watching football. I had been 15. He'd handed me a small wooden box. Inside was an old brass key. I remembered laughing because I thought it was just an old key he had found somewhere. He'd smiled and said, "Keep it safe." I had asked what it opened. He'd said, "You'll know when you're older." I had completely forgotten about it. Until that moment. "The key," I whispered. My father's face changed. Tyler looked at him. "What key?" Tyler asked. I stood up. "Wait here." I went upstairs. My bedroom had already been emptied. That was one of the worst parts of the whole thing. Someone had taken down my old photographs. The bookshelf was half empty. The closet looked like someone had gone through it in a hurry. I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. There was a small box underneath an old sweatshirt. I hadn't looked inside it in years. The brass key was still there. So was a folded note. My hand started shaking before I even opened it. The handwriting was my grandfather's. I read it slowly. It said, "If you're reading this, you're old enough to know that the house is yours. Your father is supposed to protect it until you're ready. If he ever tells you otherwise, ask him to show you this letter." I sat on the floor. There was more. Never let anyone convince you that family means giving up what was entrusted to you. Love someone if you can. Forgive them if you choose. But don't surrender your future just because they call it selfish. I pressed the paper against my chest. I hadn't cried when I saw the sold sign. I hadn't cried when my father admitted he'd lied. But that note broke something open in me. My grandfather had known. He had known there might come a day when my father would make me question whether I had any right to the place I grew up. And he'd prepared for it. I went back downstairs. My father was still sitting at the table. I placed the note in front of him. He stared at it. "I thought you destroyed this." His voice was barely audible. "You knew about it." "Yes." "You knew the house was mine." "Yes." "And you still tried to sell it." He looked at me. I was drowning. That was the first honest thing he'd said all night. He explained that the family business had been struggling for years. A failed expansion had left him with substantial debt. He had refinanced the business, then borrowed against other assets. Eventually, creditors began pushing harder. The house was valuable. Much more valuable than he had ever admitted. He had convinced himself that selling it would solve everything. "I told myself your grandfather would have understood," he said. "He wouldn't have." "I know. Then why did you do it?" He looked down at the note. "Because I thought I could fix everything before you ever found out." That was the part I almost understood. Not the betrayal. The desperation. But desperation didn't make the decision right. "Who forged my signature?" My father didn't answer. Tyler did. Your dad asked me to find someone who could prepare the paperwork. I looked at him. What? I didn't know your signature was going to be forged. My father's eyes closed. Tyler wasn't involved in that. Then who was? My father looked toward the hallway. And that's when I knew. There was someone else. Someone who had been in this from the beginning. Your Uncle Mark, my father said. I stared at him. My uncle had been my grandfather's accountant. He had also been handling some of my father's business paperwork for years. He knew about the trust, Dad continued. He knew the title problem. He told me he could get everything transferred quickly. Transferred how? He said there was an old authorization document. There wasn't. I know that now. I felt sick. So he forged my signature. My father nodded. But why? Tyler answered before Dad could. Because Mark wasn't trying to sell the house to an ordinary buyer. He pulled another document from the folder. I read the name of the purchasing company. Then, I looked at him. Who's behind it? Tyler hesitated. Mark. I stared at the page. The buyer was a company, registered under a business address I'd never seen before. But Tyler had already investigated it. The company was controlled by a holding entity. And that holding entity was connected to my uncle. He hadn't simply been helping my father sell the house. He had been positioning himself to acquire it at a price far below its actual value. The sold sign had been part of a plan that was never really about an outside buyer. My father was trying to get rid of the house. My uncle was trying to get it. And both of them had counted on me never asking questions. I suddenly understood why Tyler had looked sick when I came through the door. He'd realized what they were doing. But he had also been afraid to go against my father. I looked at him. Why did you help them? He lowered his eyes. Because I thought I was helping your dad save the family. By taking my house? No. He looked at me. Not by taking it. I thought the sale was legitimate. I didn't know your name had been forged until the title company called me. That distinction mattered. Tyler had made mistakes, but he hadn't signed my name. Then why stay quiet? He took a breath. Because your dad is my father-in-law. I nodded. That's not an excuse. I know. Nobody argued. For once, nobody tried to make me feel unreasonable. My father reached for the note. Your grandfather didn't trust me with the house. I sat across from him. No. He trusted you. Yes. I spent years telling myself that meant he didn't trust me. My father looked at the floor. But now I realize he was giving me a chance to prove him wrong. His voice cracked. And I failed. That was the moment I finally saw how deeply he understood what he'd done. Not because the sale had fallen apart. Not because the title company had stopped it. Because he'd betrayed the person his own father had trusted. Me. I picked up my phone. I'm calling an attorney. My father nodded. I'll pay for it. No. He looked surprised. This isn't your problem to fix anymore. I called the number Tyler had given me for the title attorney. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, calls, and uncomfortable truths. The attorney confirmed what my grandfather's trust document said. The house was intended for me. The attempted sale could not be completed without my valid authorization. The signature on the transfer document wasn't mine. And because the title company had caught the discrepancy before closing, the property had never legally transferred to the buyer. The sold sign came down. But that wasn't the end. My Uncle Mark was confronted with the documents. At first, he denied everything. Then the attorney showed him the records, the forged signature, the emails, the draft transfer paperwork, the communications with the holding company. Eventually, he stopped denying it. He admitted he had prepared the paperwork, after my father asked him to make the problem go away. My father hadn't explicitly told him to forge my name, but he had knowingly accepted documents he knew I hadn't signed. That was enough. The attempted sale collapsed. The property remained in the trust. And for the first time in my life, I had a lawyer explain to me that I didn't need my father's permission to decide what happened to my own home. A month later, we changed the locks. I stood on the front porch, holding the brass key my grandfather had given me. It fit. Of course it did. I almost laughed. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. My father stood behind me. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. I looked back at him. "I don't know if I can." He nodded. "I understand. What happens now?" He looked at the house. "I'll move out." I hadn't asked him to. He said it anyway. "I've lived here my whole life," he continued, "but I think it's time I let you decide what home means to you." That sentence stayed with me, because for years, I'd thought home was something my family could take away. It wasn't. Home was the smell of my grandmother's cooking in the kitchen, the marks on the wall where Grandpa measured my height, the old tree outside my bedroom, the tiny crack in the hallway floor where I'd tripped when I was 6, the place where my mother had taught me how to wrap Christmas presents. Those memories didn't belong to my father. They didn't belong to my uncle. And they definitely didn't belong to a buyer who had never even stepped inside. They belonged to me. Tyler came by a few weeks later. He stood on the porch holding a small cardboard box. "I found these in the garage." Inside were old family photographs. I looked through them slowly. There was one of Grandpa holding me when I was a baby, another of me sitting beside him on the porch, and one of my father, Grandpa, and me, standing in front of the house. I turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. Grandpa's handwriting again. 3 generations. 1 home. Make sure the third knows it was always hers. I stared at it for a long time. Tyler looked away. "I should have told you sooner." "Yes. I was scared." "I know. I'm sorry." I nodded. "I'm still angry." "I know. But I don't hate you." He smiled faintly. "That's more than I deserve." Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I didn't know yet. My relationship with my father changed too. Not overnight. There were no dramatic hugs, no magical forgiveness. He started respecting boundaries. He stopped making decisions for me. And eventually, he admitted something that I think he'd been too ashamed to say for years. "I thought being your father meant I had the right to decide what was best for you." I told him, "Being my father meant you should have trusted me enough to let me decide." He nodded. "I know that now." My father eventually moved into a smaller place across town. The family business survived, although barely. The attempted sale had forced him to confront debts and decisions he'd been avoiding for years. He sold some assets, renegotiated others, and stepped away from the parts of the business he could no longer manage. My uncle was no longer involved. There were legal consequences for the forged documents, and the entire experience permanently changed the way our family handled money and property. As for the house, I didn't sell it. For a while, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it. Then one Saturday morning, I opened the windows, cleaned out the rooms, and painted the kitchen. I kept Grandpa's height marks on the pantry door. I kept the old porch swing. I even kept the ugly carpet in the hallway because my grandfather had installed it himself, and somehow removing it felt like erasing him. The sold sign was long gone. In its place, there was nothing. Just the house. Mine. Not because I had fought someone for it. Not because I had won some huge legal battle. But because my grandfather had trusted me with it long before I was old enough to understand what that trust meant. The night I came home and saw that sold sign, I thought my family had already taken my childhood away from me. I was wrong. They had tried. But they hadn't understood something my grandfather had understood years before. A home isn't something you own simply because your name appears on a deed. It's something you protect because you know what it means to the people who come after you. And that night, when I locked the front door with the little brass key Grandpa had given me when I was 15, I finally understood why he'd smiled when he told me to keep it safe. He wasn't giving me a key to a house. He was giving me proof that even when the people closest to me forgot who I was, someone had never forgotten.